We are doing something that is a little bit different than perhaps you're used to in our shiurim, because we are in the middle of a series on life, which is sort of going to take a break over the next week or two, with this week being Lag BaOmer and Siyum HaRambam, which is why we're talking about Rambam today. And as you saw in the video before we went live, that it is a global study. I mean, this is a personality. Rambam is probably one of the most famous Jews in all of history. And therefore, probably a lot of people know more as Maimonides, but like when we say tefillin or phylacteries, does it make a difference which word I'm using, the Hebrew or the Latin? I think they both sound Chinese to most people, so I may as well go with the Hebrew. His Hebrew name was Rambam Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, but as you saw in the second video we watched, a lot of people knew him as, Maimonides is because his father's name was Maimon, so Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. As you can see this picture of him here, I don't know if this is a artist's, I guess, rendition of what he looked like. Either way, he lived during the latter part of the 12th century. So today we're dedicating the shir to Rambam, tomorrow to Lag BaOmer, and then we have Shavuos coming up. We'll have to do some preparation for Shavuos as well. So with all the combination, we'll get back to our course about the soul as well. Now, the headstone of Rambam's resting place, have any of you been there ever? No, you have been there, Miriam. It
My
is.
friend actually lives on the property where the kever is.
How do people live on the property of the kever?
There's the kever, which is next door,
Yeah?
the courtyard, and the house.
Wow, it's quite a big property, I must say. I was there about 12 or 13 years ago with Batya. Oh, no, more, 2009. 13 years ago I was there. I think the only time I recall being at Rambam's kever. So we were there just for a few minutes. It happened to be, we were driving by, and I think it was either his yard site that day. Yeah, we were in Israel, and it was Rambam's yard site, the 24th of Tevet. Or the 20th of Tevet. So we popped in, right? He passed away in 1204 in Cairo. And this is a picture of his resting place. This is in Tzfat, no, not Tzfat, in Tiberias, very good. Tiberias, Israel. And yesterday we talked about Tiberias in the story about the Chamei Tveria, the hot springs of Tiberias. That's where Rambam's buried, in that city. It's actually a beautiful city. I once stopped at a restaurant when I was on the birthright trip. So they took us to a restaurant there called Dex. The entire restaurant is on the deck by the water, so quite a nice place. It's actually a very beautiful city. But what does it say on the top of his grave? Can you all see? It says, well, don't worry. If you can't see, I'll describe it to you. The question is if those watching us online can see. It says these words, Mimoshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe. From Moshe, that's Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our great teacher who gave us the Torah, till Moshe Maimonides, nobody arose like Moshe. Now, we've had many great sages in Jewish history, whether it was prophets and prophetesses, and many great rabbis and rebbitzins, Tanaim, Amoraim, Rishonim, Acharonim, many, many greats. The fact that he was given this title, not call it title, what is the right word for this slogan? It's a stunning statement. Okay, there were about 50 generations from the biblical Moshe until the times of Rambam. It's a very long period of history. And during these times, the Jewish people have had many great prophets and judges and kings and high priests and sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud and Gaonim, brilliant geniuses. And yet, this statement is not recorded for any one of them. That's not to say that none of them were as great, but it is to tell us how the people of his generation felt about him. Like perhaps we feel about our Rebbe, the people of his generation felt so passionate and amazed by Rambam that they said, until him, there was no one as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, so to say. Right? It's something about Rambam that obviously rendered him, at least in some respects, and at least to his followers, that great, equivalent to Moshe Rabbeinu in ways that are entirely unprecedented. I know when people were talking about the Rebbe being Mashiach, at the end of the day, I don't want to get controversial here, we will find out when Mashiach comes who Mashiach is. And it's silly and no purpose in us trying to identify or to argue about it. But I remember one particular rabbi, his students were saying, how could they say that about the Rebbe? So the rabbi said to his students, listen, they're not saying it about you and me. So about Rambam, even if there were other great sages in history who were as great as Moses, nobody was called that. It's certainly a unique title, a unique slogan that's attributed to Rambam. And I think it tells us something about who he was. He was a fascinating person. He was a rabbi. He was a teacher. He was an author. He was a doctor. Very good. Anyone else know more about him? He was a philosopher. He was a communal leader, a physician. And his works, which he authored more than 8, how many books? I have to remember the number of books. We'll get to it. It's in my slides. Okay? No, even more than 5 books, because we'll go through it. It was on the video before. I know that I have it in the slides. You'll see it just now. Okay, but he authored many, many books. And we're talking about 800 years ago, right? And they're still studied widely till this day. Rambam is studied. And his name today is, like you saw on the other film, ubiquitous. How many hospitals are called a Rambam hospital or Maimonides? I was born in Maimonides Hospital in Brooklyn. Okay, there are schools, Maimonides School or Rambam schools. Here in our community, we have the Rambam Trust. It's a free loan, I don't know what you call it, bank, society, lends money to people in the community, interest-free. I'm personally paying off a Rambam loan right now for my my studies I did last year. It cost a lot of money to get my master's. So I took a loan from Rambam. Paying it off. Interest-free. Quite incredible. So they obviously have qualifications of who they'll lend to and how, but anyone in the community, you have to bring a surety. I think you have to bring 2 people who will sign surety for you. I'm maxed out already. I signed for too many people. I hope none of them, what do you call it? None of them foreclose, or what's the term where they don't pay up? I was having trouble with one. I was getting scared, right? But the name Rambam is so widely used in so many ways. I mean, there are schools and there are streets, and they mention their, what do they say? Stamps, currencies. Which currency is it? Israeli currency. Yeah. So it's certainly appropriate that we should understand who he was, because we haven't really done that much. We study his teachings. We don't know who he is. Now, it would be nice if we could have a shiur created for every great sage that ever lived, but considering that there are thousands of Jews around the world who study Rambam, myself included. I have a weekly shiur with someone on Rambam. I wish I could say I do the daily study as many of my colleagues do, and as you saw in the video earlier, that the Rebbe encouraged everyone to study, which is in the presentation, so I'll show you later, the options you have, whether it's 3 chapters a day, which will probably take you close to an hour if you want to study it properly, or 1 chapter a day, which you would probably have to commit at least 15, 20 minutes to study properly, and it will take you 3 years to finish his teachings, his Mishnah Torah, if you do that. Or even just say for our mitzvahs, 1 mitzvah a day. Either way, there are thousands of Jews who study Rambam, and it's a great opportunity for us to learn a little bit about him, and about his influence, about who he was, especially because he had such a great impact on Jewish history. And the completion of the study of Rambam, which will take place on Lag BaOmer this Thursday. So it coincides with Lag BaOmer, such a holy day. Lag BaOmer, why do we light bonfires? We'll talk more about that tomorrow. But the bonfires symbolize the great light of Torah that was taught by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whose yard site is on Lag BaOmer. So quite amazing. I don't want to say coincidence, because nothing is ever coincidence. But when it's not that you pick a date when to complete the study of the cycle of Rambam. It was started, this study cycle, in 1984 by the Rebbe, and every year it concludes on another date, because it's a matter of, it's a leap year, it will take a little bit shorter, but it's just a matter of when you complete the actual cycle of the study. So how amazing is it that the day that the completion of this study cycle happens to be Lag BaOmer, the day that we celebrate the great light of the inner mystical teachings of Torah as they were elucidated by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So it's really a joyous accomplishment for all those who studied it. And it's natural to want to share that joy with others. And in fact, that's why there are celebrations in our community. There's going to be at the yeshiva on Thursday night. And Saturday night, we at Chabad House are going to have a virtual event on Zoom. So look out for it. This is a little bit of a rehearsal for that. No, just kidding. So the point is that when you study and you complete the session of study, then you share it with others. Because as the expression goes, Berov am hadras melech, there's greater glory for the study of Torah when there's more people. And of course, when you learn, it's always valuable. So just being here, being present, whether you're watching online or with us here at the Shir, it's worthwhile and no doubt valuable to learn something new. And of course, if I could encourage you to start studying too, it would be worthwhile if you need to add something else to your daily study sessions. If you're not studying enough, why not something else to add on? Think when you have a birthday party or a graduation or whatever special event, it's a special milestone and you want to have and invite others to join in your study. So when it comes to the Rambam, we invite as many people to join along in the study as well. And here you could just see how many different themes are dedicated to Rambam. Whether, as you see in this image, it's the currencies and the stamps and the schools and the hospitals, etc., etc. Rambam obviously is quite famous. So I just want to ask a few questions before we launch into this. Did you ever have a chance to read or study any part of Rambam's works? No? There's a variety. There's Mishnah Torah, which is probably the most famous. That's Code of Jewish Law. There is Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed. There is Sefer HaMitzvot, which is a very condensed, concise codification of Jewish law. There are many Igorot, letters of the Rambam, and medical writings. Not all of his teachings are all religious in nature. Many of them, by the way, were written in Arabic. Not all. Some were written in Hebrew. Many were written in Hebrew, especially his halachic works were written in Hebrew. But a lot of his philosophy was written in Arabic because he lived in Egypt, in Cairo. And that's the spoken language of the country. So many of his works are in Arabic. Very interesting. Okay. When you hear of Rambam, what comes to your mind? Law? Jewish law? Philosophy? Rambam mentions many of the great philosophers who preceded him. Yeah? And sometimes he vehemently disagrees with many of their theories. So Rambam, as a philosopher, had a lot on philosophy. As a physician, had a lot on medicine. As a rabbi, taught a lot about mitzvahs. As a sage, shared insights from the Talmud. As perhaps a theologian, shared aspects about faith. When you study Rambam, you really get a holistic perspective on so many aspects and areas of Judaism, yeah?
Also, he talks the Jewish perspective on science.
Science, yeah. It's true. He did. So, now obviously, science has evolved a lot since then.
Still does,
And it's still evolving, right?
but what
Right. So yeah, that's true. And when you study Rambam, you see what a great personality he was. Now I'm going to show you a video in a moment, which also goes to show. I feel like we talked about Rabbi Akiva, who had a late start in his Judaism. Right, he only started at age 40, even learning Torah. Rabbi Rambam, Maimonides, he didn't have it easy either. We take life for granted the way we live our lives today. Life is easy. You should see the difficulties when I hear about how my parents grew up. Gee, I can't even compare.
You came out of Russia too. It was terrible in those times.
Exactly.
Terrible.
Our grandparents. We'll watch the video now about Rambam's life. Not easy. But yet, look how much he achieved. Look how much he achieved. So I think it's something for us to consider. In fact, our parsha this week talks about the Jubilee. You should declare freedom in the land. I grew up going as a kid sometimes to Philadelphia, which is right next to New York. And in Philly, there's the Liberty Bell. Anyone been to the Liberty Bell? Anyone know what it says in it? Declare freedom throughout the land. That's what it says. It's a verse from our parsha this week. And of course, it was declared during the Jubilee. Now, last week, there was a lady in Florida who celebrated her second Jubilee, her 100th birthday. How many of us are lucky for that? And she had a bucket list. And on her bucket list was, anyone know? Skydiving. I did it when I was 20, for my 20th birthday. She did it at 100. She jumped off a plane last week, and she survived. She's around. She's here to tell the story. So, 2 Jubilees. We think about, 100 years, they were interviewing this lady and how life has evolved and changed in the past century in so many ways. So as you're going to watch this video now about Rambam, just think about how he was able to achieve what he has. And I say this because yesterday we talked about Pesach Sheni, the messages and lessons that we could learn. We're nitokim farfalin, it's never too late, and there's always time for a second chance in life. And as you'll see Rambam's story, I want you to think about that theme. Let's put the video on. Let's see. Or at least here.
In the spring of 1138, Jews in the southern Spanish city of Cordoba were preparing for Passover, the festival of deliverance. But the household of the esteemed rabbinical judge of Cordoba, Rabbi Maimon, was celebrating a delivery of another kind. Just one day shy of Passover, the rabbi and his wife welcomed their eldest son, whom they named Moshe, Hebrew for Moses. Little did the rabbi know that he was destined to gain eternal fame through Moshe, for his brilliant child grew into the universally acclaimed scholar known as Moses Maimonides, or Moshe, the son of Maimon. It was a trying time for the Jews of Spain. The Almohads, a fanatical Islamic movement bent on establishing a caliphate, were gradually overrunning the Iberian Peninsula. Countless Jews were murdered, others were forced to convert, while many families fled Spain. Maimonides was 10 years of age when his family was forced to flee. They settled in Fez, Morocco, where his brilliant father shaped him into a Talmudic scholar of repute.
He also mastered what we call chokhmah, which is the universal wisdom of humankind. He knew the works of Aristotle and Plato and their Islamic interpreters and so on.
Maimonides also became an expert in astronomy and medicine. In 1165, the family journeyed to the land of Israel, but unable to settle, they continued to the large Jewish community of Cairo, where Maimonides married and settled down. He then devoted a complete decade, approximately from 1168 to 1177, to producing his crowning literary achievement, the Mishnah Torah.
He was an ish halacha. He was the greatest rabbi of the Middle Ages. He wrote the greatest law code in all of Jewish history, the Mishnah Torah. He was an absolutely outstanding master halachist.
For the first time since God gave the Torah at Sinai, the entire body of Jewish law would be codified in a systemic, clear, and concise fashion. The 14-volume masterpiece created a powerful impression across the Jewish world. Then, in 1177, tragedy struck. Maimonides' brother, David, drowned when his ship, fully laden with merchandise, sunk in the Indian Ocean. The brothers had shared a deep bond, and Maimonides grieved terribly for years. David had also been Maimonides' business partner, and this calamity meant financial ruination for Maimonides, who was now forced to become a doctor. His expertise soon caught the attention of the Egyptian ruler Sultan Saladin, who appointed Maimonides to the position of royal physician. Maimonides also served as the leader of Egyptian Jewry. He juggled his time between his royal duties, treating private patients, serving as a statesman for the Jewish community, teaching Torah, and discussing medicine, philosophy, and science with his non-Jewish audiences. Maimonides described his schedule in a letter to a dear student, Rabbi Samuel ibn Taban of Provence.
I live in Fostad, and the Sultan lives in Cairo. I must see him every morning to check on his health. As a rule, I am in Cairo early each day, and even if nothing unusual happens, by the time I get back to Fostad, half the day is gone. When I come home, my foyer is always full of people, Jews and non-Jews, important people and not, judges and policemen. I apologize and ask that they should be kind enough to give me a few minutes to eat. That is the only meal I take in 24 hours. Patients go in and out until nightfall. And sometimes, I swear to you by the Torah, it is 2 hours into the night before they are all gone. I talk to them and prescribe for them, even while lying down on my back from exhaustion. On Shabbat, the whole congregation, or at least the majority of it, comes to my house after morning services, and I instruct the members of the community as to what they should do during the entire week. We learn together in a week fashion until the afternoon. This is my schedule.
His quill hardly saw any rest either. Jewish communities from distant lands sought his advice and rulings on Jewish law, and Maimonides felt compelled to pen yet another literary masterpiece to forestall a developing crisis in Jewish faith. Many Jewish scholars in the Arabic lands had been swept up in the newfound Islamic obsession with Greek philosophy. This left some Jewish scholars deeply disturbed by the apparent intellectual contradictions between contemporary Greco-Islamic philosophy and various precepts of the Torah. In 1191, Maimonides published a treatise that thoroughly addressed these issues from a philosophical standpoint, under the title, Guide for the Perplexed. When Maimonides passed away in 1204, the entire Jewish world mourned his passing. An epitaph without historical parallel was carved into his gravestone, proclaiming that since the days of Moses, no Jewish leader's achievements had rivaled that of Moses Maimonides.
Yeah. Moshe. Moshe. Ben Maimon. In those days, there were no surnames. People were usually called by their parents' name. So his surname was technically Maimonides, the son of Maimon. Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. It's an acronym. Okay, so it's an acronym of the words Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. All right. We did that already, right? Okay, let's talk about some of his works now. And with that in mind, there are many, many works, as you saw on the video. His final work was this one called Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed. And in this book, he wanted to demonstrate that Judaism could be compatible with all the other philosophical ideas of that time. I don't know about compatible exactly, but But Moreh Nevuchim was a Jewish guide to the perplexed, dealing with a lot of the philosophical questions at the time from a Jewish paradigm, from a Jewish perspective. His first literary work, which he completed at quite a young age, at 30, was a commentary on the full 6 orders of the Mishnah, and it's within this commentary that in his introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, where Rambam highlights the 13 principles of Jewish faith, the 13 beliefs within Judaism, again, from his view, which, by the way, was very controversial. A lot of sages did not agree with him on these 13. I was walking back from a funeral yesterday, and somebody was arguing with me about them. I said, look, what are you arguing with me? I'm not the author of the book. You can talk to Rambam. You want to talk to Rambam, wait. But the point, though, is that Rambam even came up with 13 fundamental principles of Jewish faith. Okay, this person was actually debating with me how Rambam could say, if you don't believe these ideas, then you're an apostate and you're going to go to hell and things like that. I said, look, I'm not certain that he says those words, but the point, though, is he does say that these are fundamentals of Judaism upon which the entire Torah stands. So that was Rambam's Magnum Opus, call it, is the Mishnah Torah. That was his work on the Mishnah right here. His work on the Mishnah. Let me just put this aside so you can see better. How do I hide that? There we go. His commentary on the Mishnah. Now I want to talk about his Magnum Opus, which is the Mishnah Torah. This was a monumental work, and for the first time, basically, he would codify all of Jewish law in a systematic, clear, and concise fashion. Okay, and that's probably what I wanted to talk about the most today, because that is what most people studying this cycle is of Mishnah Torah. Even though the other works are also important and are also monumental, but this is probably the one that's studied most now. And the Rambam wrote a lengthy introduction to Mishnah Torah, and he explains why he wrote that book. And he says that what he wanted to achieve. Just a second. Just a second here. Somebody wants a section 18a and wants it right now. So I have to just address him right there. This is what happens when I have a phone in front of me. I can still get messages. And I know it's distracting, so to try not to do that. Okay, what was I telling you? The Mishnah Torah, which you could see right here, an earlier copy. What version is this? From what year is this copy? Pardon? Yeah, he writes that in the introduction. I'm trying to figure out, by looking at the screen, what year this printing is from. Because don't forget, when he published this in the 12th century, there was no printing press yet. So it was a handwritten manuscript. But yeah, he writes in the introduction of what the purpose is, of why he wrote it, and let's look at the introduction just to get started, okay? So I'm going to put the text of the introduction here for you. Let's put it up here. Okay, just a little bit of information about the book. The mitzvahs, okay, firstly, right here, he says it took Maimonides 10 years to author the Mishnah Torah. Just to give you an idea. And can you see the screen clearly? These are JLI productions. The work was completed around the year 1180. And let's see what's next. Okay, let's go into the introduction right now. All ready? I'm going to put the text on the screen so we can all read it together. says as follows: the mitzvahs given to Moses at Mount Sinai were all given together with their explanations. Moshe Rabbeinu personally transcribed the entire Torah before he died. He did not, however, transcribe the explanation of the Torah. Instead, he commanded it verbally to the elders, to Joshua, and to the totality of Israel, as it says in Deuteronomy, "Be careful to observe everything that I prescribe to you." For this reason, it is called the oral law. Now, Rambam highlights here that the oral law is not some later day addition by the great rabbis. He's saying that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he gave us the Torah at Mount Sinai, so we're preparing now for Shavuos, so it's important we understand this. And the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot tells us, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai. U'mesara leHoshua, he gave it to Joshua. Maimonides is telling us here that Moshe brought the oral Torah along with the written Torah, and he gave it to the Jewish people. And they're both derived from the same source. This is what he learned at Mount Sinai. And the only difference is that while the written Torah is made up of the words that God dictated to Moshe to write in the Torah itself, the oral Torah is comprised of the verbal explanations that God instructed to Moshe to relay to the Jewish people. Sort of, we're doing a lecture, a lesson, and perhaps we have the textbook, right? You're sitting with your textbook, but besides for the textbook, the presenter, the professor, is also teaching verbally. Isn't that the way it works pretty much in any college class? You don't need the teacher to sit there reading the textbook to you. But the teacher's explaining what's written in the book. So Rambam then clarifies that there's an additional category of oral Torah, and these are laws that were not taught at Mount Sinai, but rather they were deduced by the sages throughout history using the 13 principles, not of the fundamentals of faith that we discussed, but these are called the how would you call them? 13, we read it in our prayers every morning. 13 principles of exegesis, of Rabbi Yishmael Emma B'Shloish Esra Midas HaTorah Nidreshes, how the Torah is learned, how we learn laws from the Torah. Okay, there's obviously rabbinic decrees, there are customs, where these are derived from the Torah. And of course, within that, there's a lot to understand how it works, what's taught, how it was ratified by the Sanhedrin. And these were not written in any formal work, but were taught verbally throughout our history from teacher to student. And this was the status quo, the generations, until the beginning of the 3rd century. And what Rambam says, what he says is actually, we have a video here to summarize this teaching. So let me just put it up on a video. Okay. So you have the exegesis, the explanations of the mitzvahs given by God, the laws deduced by the sages, and let us watch a video that will explain it for us. Okay.
The 5 books of Moses, known as the written Torah, was accompanied by an oral tradition passed down from teacher to pupil for over 1,000 years. During this time, these ideas were not formally committed to writing, and in fact, it was prohibited to do so. The intention was for students to learn directly from teachers and to accept personal responsibility for preserving the teachings for the next generation. Yet toward the end of the 2nd century, the oral Torah was recorded in a book known as the Mishnah. Why did this happen? And who had the audacity to change the status quo? Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was head of the Sanhedrin. His piety, Torah scholarship, and wisdom earned him the name Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy teacher. It was he who made the momentous decision to record the oral law. The situation of the Jews was precarious. The might of the Roman Empire had spread its tentacles and ruled over the Jewish people in Israel. Around 100 years previously, the Romans had destroyed the Second Temple. Countless Jews were killed, forced into exile, and sold into slavery. Similar atrocities occurred a few decades later when the Romans crushed the Bar Kokhba rebellion. At certain points, the study of Torah was forbidden on pain of death. Religious practices were banned, and Torah sages were murdered. An oral method of transmission has advantages, but it can only flourish when people are living together in peace with a strong presence of scholars and teachers. However, under the circumstances of oppression and dispersion that existed at the time, an oral means of transmission was not advantageous, as it jeopardized the accurate preservation of these treasured teachings. Considering these realities, Rabbi Yehuda made the bold decision to record the oral Torah. Indeed, over the next 2,000 years, the Jewish people often experienced great suffering, dispersions, and weakening of scholarship. Were it not for Rabbi Yehuda's revolutionary vision in writing down the Mishnah, many sacred teachings and practices would have been lost forever.
Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So when he's talking about Rabbi Yehuda here, he's talking about Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, who gave us the Mishnah. Okay, so a few centuries after the Mishnah was written, came the Talmud, which was authored as a commentary on the Mishnah. It was compiled by Ravina and Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi. Okay, these were Talmudic sages, and they were in Babylon, in Iraq. Okay, and Talmud Bavli is the more famous than the Israeli Talmud, which was composed in Israel, called Talmud Yerushalmi. Here, let's look at it in the words of Maimonides himself in the introduction. He says, Rav Ashi composed the Babylonian Talmud in Babylonia, approximately 100 years after Rabbi Yochanan composed the Jerusalem Talmud. So actually, the Jerusalem Talmud came first. The intent of both is to elucidate the words of the Mishnah, to explain its deeper points, and to relate the new teachings that were developed by each court from the era of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi until the composition of the Talmud. Yeah, well, we can learn both. If you look right here in our library, we have both the Babylonian Talmud as well as the Jerusalem Talmud. But certainly I would say that the Babylonian Talmud is more renowned and more prominent, and is probably much fuller than the Jerusalem Talmud. There were more Jews living outside of Israel, mostly in Iraq at the time, and that's where the great sages lived. The Sanhedrin was abolished in Israel by the Roman government, but much of the yeshiva learning had moved to Iraq. Sort of what's basically the history of the last 2,000 years, where most of Jews lived outside of Israel. Even still today, most Jews live outside of Israel. The difference, I would say, is that Israel has more Jews than any other country in the world, which wasn't the case. Probably a decade ago, there were more Jews in the USA than in Israel. So that is what he's told us here. Okay? The thing is, let's go to text 3 because we have a little bit of a question. Let's read text 3 and we'll analyze it a little bit further. The Talmud, says Maimonides here, the Talmud style is quite complex and is composed in Aramaic with a mixture of other languages. This language was understood at the time by the people living in Babylonia. Interestingly, somebody came into my shul on Sunday, wanted to learn with me, and he said he wants to learn Gemara. I said, great. He says, because he reads Hebrew, he's going to know the Gemara perfect. He could read it and teach it to me. Perfect. I'm not a great scholar. He opens the Gemara and he's cracking his teeth. It's written in Hebrew letters, but it's not modern Hebrew. Okay, it's Aramaic. So Rambam's just giving us a little bit of the background so you know and understand what the Gemara is. This language was understood at the time by the people living in Babylonia. In other places, however, and even in Babylonia itself today, this language is not comprehensible unless one has studied it. Rambam's writing this 900 years ago. Try today, 800 years ago. Try today going to Babylonia, going to Iraq, and talking to people in Aramaic. It's not a current language. Only Gemara is written in that language. Yeah. A lot of our scripts and prayers are Kaddish is in Aramaic. The reason simply is because it's meant to be said in the language you understand. So if you understand English or Zulu or Afrikaans or French, then that's the language you should be praying in. The reason we still pray many of these languages in Aramaic is, you know why? Tradition. That's why. Now, there are only a select few who comprehend the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud and the other works of Medrash. They require a breadth of knowledge, spirit of wisdom, and much time in order to truly learn from them the many laws of the Torah. So you really have to have a very good, vast knowledge. You have to study a lot to really, truly understand this all. So Rambam, therefore, figured, for most people, especially if they're getting a late start, it's not going to be easy to catch up. Says Rambam, let's read what he says further in the introduction. Therefore, with a deep trust in God, I girded my loins. I, Moses, the son of Maimon of Spain. Well, he calls himself Hasfardi. What does Hasfardi mean? From Spain. Anyone here is a Sephardi? Okay, Sephardic Jews generally are from Spain. I contemplated all these texts and sought to compose a work that would summarize their conclusions regarding all matters of Torah law in clear and concise terms. In this way, the oral law could be organized for everyone without complication, to those of lesser stature and to those of greater stature. So this is what Rambam was trying to achieve. Continuing in his intro, he says, therefore I have called this text Mishnah Torah, meaning second to the Torah. Now, there's a difference between the words Mishnah and Mishneh, because I often say we study Mishnah. Mishnah means a teaching. Mishneh means second to. Okay, the word Mishnah comes from the word Vishinantam, which we say in our Shema, Vishinantam Levanecha V'dibartabam. It's a biblical commandment from God to teach it to your children. That's Mishnah. Okay, the root is Shona. The basic meaning is repeated learning. Because the oral law was not written, it was necessary for constant repeated learning in order for people to remember the teachings. The word Mishneh, on the other hand, which is what he called his work, Mishneh Torah, is a completely different word. I know it's spelled the same, but as many words in Hebrew, it can be spelled the same and have a different meaning. That's why I'm telling it to you this. For example, Mishneh Lamelech means the prime minister, the second to the, well, maybe not prime minister, second to the king. So that's the difference between Mishnah and Mishneh. So in his words, as he says here, I'm calling it Mishneh Torah, meaning second to the Torah. For a person could study the written Torah and this text and thereby comprehend the entire Torah without having to study any other text. How do you like that? In the words of the author himself. Did he manage to sell it to you yet? Now, of course, what you see here is what was so unique about Rambam and how he differed so much from all the great ones who preceded him. Because as far as we know, no one ever attempted to author such an ambitious work, so comprehensive on the one hand, and yet so concise and accessible on the other hand. So no one ever thought to claim that their work could be Mishneh Torah, second to the Torah, and that's it. No other work of Jewish law is necessary. And I'm not telling you now that you don't have to study anything else in Judaism. Rambam says it, and you could take his word for it, okay? And truly, in that way, from Moshe to Moshe, there was nobody like Moshe. Rambam did not really intend to displace the Talmud study or other works of Jewish law. I don't think that was his idea, that all you need is 2 books, have a Torah and have a Maimonides, and you don't need anything else. But because of Mishnah Torah itself, he rules that 1/3 of your studies have to be focused on the Gemara, which is defined as halachic reasoning, as comparisons, as shakal v'tarya. You know what shakal v'tarya means? When somebody says shakal v'tarya, literally means like give and take. When you're studying Gemara, nobody sits and studies Gemara like this. You fall asleep. You have to be animated and alive and into it. That's the way you study it. There's so many different angles to analyze and to dissect and to, in every way, try to learn, right? So, without studying those, I don't know if you really truly have everything it takes. But he's saying if you don't have the time to study all that in depth, by studying Mishnah Torah, you will have a very comprehensive glimpse at all of the Torah's teachings. I think that's his point. So I think he's telling you that if you really want to know Jewish law, or you want to have at least a taste of it, then study his work. Yeah. 1 chapter a day? Now 1 chapter a day should take you 3 years. You did 1 mitzvah a day or 3 chapters? 3 chapters a day will take you a year. Yeah. Now the truth is, it's not just 1 book, because there are 14 books in Mishnah Torah. That's what he calls a Yad HaChazaka. Yad is hand. Something interesting, if you look at your hand here, at your fingers or your phalanges, you'll see that there's 14 sections. Just do a quick count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? Each finger has 3 except for your thumb that has 2. 14 is Yad. Just an interesting observation. At the end of the day, we don't rule based on Rambam's findings per se, and that's why, practically speaking, it's not enough to just study Rambam. But I do think that studying it will give you a very comprehensive perspective on Jewish law. Now, this 14-volume work took Rambam, let's just find it, here we go. It took him 10 years to author, okay? And it was finally completed and published around 1180. Let's put this up here. Where did it go? Here you can see what these look like. Just, printings of it, older versions. Okay, Rabbi Yitzchak Shilat, he says that the 10 years of authorship were from 1168 to 1177. And then there was further editing and copying that continued until 1180. So just imagine that it took him 13 years in total to publish this work. 13 years. But even after he finished it, right, he was fine-tuning it. And we have a number of letters that he wrote in which he writes that the points his interlocutors raised in their letters are correct, and that he already made the necessary changes in his personal copy of Mishnah Torah. So he disseminated copies of it and got feedback. So he was able to make corrections. He's saying that it's not perfect. I had certain mistakes, and I was happy to disseminate these copies so that I could correct my errors based on that feedback. I think there's a lot to learn here.
What happened to the copies, the actual scripts?
The actual originals. Maybe they're in a museum today, I don't know. I'm not sure. There's obviously, if we have copies of it, yes, Miriam.
Talking from an archaeological perspective, there is a new Jazeera, an apostrophe of
Geniza?
Geniza maybe,
Yeah.
where documents and letters and writings are stored.
Yeah.
So it's possible that the originals might eventually be looked at and translated and made available to us from that source. It's very new.
So I don't know if we have copies of the original, and if this is, let's just see what it says here. I've got to see the screen a little better. This is MS Huntington 80, Folio V, Blyden Library. If this is an actual writing of Rambam, it could be it is. If this is an actual writing, maybe some of them have been preserved until now. But what Miriam's referring to specifically is the Cairo Geniza. If you have an interest in that, we could do a share on it. I think there's a lot to uncover. The Cairo Geniza and the Dead Sea Scrolls are two famous collections that were discovered in the past century. These are collections of ancient Jewish writings. In fact, when I was last in Israel in 2016, we went to a place called Qumran. Anyone heard of Qumran? That's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. I don't know if it was by Jews or Arabs, whoever discovered it.
Arab boys routine machine.
Yeah?
One hamster was one lost.
Yeah?
And this boy was looking for this lost sheep. And he threw a stone into a narrow opening, thinking the animal was there.
Right?
And he heard the breaking of a jar.
Wow. So that's where, in these jars, they found many, many ancient Jewish scripts, Torahs, and all, and they say these are 3,000-year-old writings, scrolls. And very interestingly, it was, a lot of these were taken to I think you can find them today at the Museum in Jerusalem. What is it called? Hebrew? That big museum there. You could see many of these Dead Sea Scrolls. So, and then there was the Cairo Geniza, where in Egypt, many ancient Jewish texts were also found. Okay, but to me, just looking at this idea of how Rambam says he made corrections, think about it. He's not young, he's an accomplished teacher, thinker, writer, philosopher, physician, a great personality. And yet he's willing to revisit his previous conclusions in light of new understandings that he learned from people who corrected him. What does that say? Is that something we could learn in our own lives, regardless of our age and stage?
He comes to that conclusion. If someone writing a letter doesn't mean that I agree with it.
Well, if he accepted it, he could have said respectfully, I disagree with you, but he didn't. He accepted corrections where they're necessary. And he writes that in his updated introduction, saying, I've made corrections as were advised. I think that's a very powerful lesson to us when you have a great leader who's willing to make these types of corrections. Okay, now let me show you something neat. Before the age of printing, books were disseminated how? Yeah, they were copied by hand. And I guess those were the publishers pre the 14th century. They would handwrite. What year was the printing press discovered? Late 1400s? When was that? Okay, I think it was late 1400s. We could easily check it up on Google, right? So here you have a manuscript of the first two volumes of Mishnah Torah, which were written during Rambam's lifetime, 12th century, what you're seeing on the screen. Okay, but these were not written by Rambam, actually. These are written by Yefes ben Shlomo. Okay, so you could see on the screen, you could see the introduction from which we were just reading. Okay, it's taken from this manuscript. And this is known as the Huntington manuscript. And this can be seen today at the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford in England. Anyone ever been there? I have. 1436. Okay. But Rambam wrote this nearly 200 years before the first printing press, or more. More than 200 years. So this copy that you're seeing on the screen is today in a university library in England at Oxford. So just to, you're asking where it is. I don't know if we have the original Rambam writings, but this is a manuscript from that time. And this manuscript is rather simple compared to the more artistic manuscripts that you may have seen, such as this one from the Kaufman collection. Look at that. Right? This is from the late 13th century. It's the same exact introduction, by the way. In this Kaufman manuscript, as you can see, it is in color, it's quite ornate, and this manuscript was written in northeastern France in 1296. Huh? Well, no, this is Rambam. The printer, okay, pre-printing press. This is 140 years before the printing press. This is 1296. Back then, I guess that was a job people had, to beautifully and ornately, with calligraphy, to transcribe these texts. So this is a very ornate version. But the Huntington manuscript, it's rich in its own unique way. Right? It appears that this copy suffered from some errors, which was common when reproductions were made by hand. Right? People not copying correctly. And the owner brought it to the Rambam himself and asked him whether he would allow him to compare this manuscript against Rambam's original. And Rambam agreed, and when the editing was complete, Rambam autographed it for him. And he wrote, "Corrected from my book, I, Moshe ben Rabbi Maimon." Okay, so very, and he writes after it something which assumingly is of blessed memory about his father. That's Ramban, Maimonides. The letter written to his son where he writes, and I don't have the voice to sing it to you, although I once did it in a concert, Shema b'ni musar avicha. That's Nachmanides, Ramban. People often confuse the two, Rambam and Ramban. I remember as a kid I was confused. In Jerusalem, there's the Ramban synagogue, because Ramban moved to Israel. He was exiled there. Rambam was only buried. Actually, Rambam also lived in Israel, but for a very short time. He moved to Tzfat, and he couldn't earn a living there, so he moved from there to Egypt. There was a larger Jewish community in Egypt than in Israel at the time. Okay. So, Rambam, he did have sons, I think. I'm almost sure he did. You're thinking about Rashi. Rashi had no sons. See, it's easy to confuse some of the greats of Jewish history. No worries. They were contemporaries. Were they contemporaries? Now, Rashi lived before Rambam, but they lived in different parts of the world. Rashi lived in France. Rambam was born in Spain, and as you saw, moved through to Morocco, and then to Israel and settled in Egypt. He lived most of his life in Egypt, whereas Rashi only had daughters, yes.
Maybe because the Spanish treated the Jews very badly, maybe they couldn't.
Yeah, but it wasn't the Spanish Inquisition, which was only 300 years later, right? The Spanish Inquisition is 1492, and that was Christian Spaniards. This was the Almohads, who I believe were Muslim. I think it was the Almohads who gave them a hard time then. So yeah, the Spanish history is a very colorful, and Jewish history there has gone through. I believe there's a new Netflix series that's come out on the Spanish Jewish history. But I don't have a Netflix account, so I haven't, and I don't have the time to watch it. But if any of you do watch it, let me know if it's good. Really? You've watched it? You're watching it. What is it called? Okay, we'll have to find out. He certainly did, yeah. Rambam had children. They did, yeah. Ears to the land. Right. Interesting. Okay. It's very interesting that this manuscript in the museum where it is housed, it said that it was owned at some point by somebody named Elazar ben Parachia, and he stipulated in his will that this and the other volumes of Rambam should remain in the public domain for consultation. He wanted it to not be a personal, private collection. We'll read that here. We'll read his exact words. So here you have Rambam's signature, and let's put it up. Let's go to the next slide. Here we go. Text 5. Where's it not going? Okay. It should be, this is again the words of Elazar ben Prachia, in its entirety be placed in keeping of the Beth Din forever, that it not be sold or redeemed, nor should any single person ever take possession of it. And this is at the University of Oxford. You could find this text. It should rather be kept available so that all scholars can correct their own version against it, but not read from it regularly or copy from it. Rather, anyone wishing to correct his version should borrow the volume he needs from the Beth Din, leaving a bond against its value with the Beth Din until he corrects his own book and returns it. That was Elazar ben Parachia's request if anybody wants to use his books. He wants his book to be public domain, but in order to ensure that it's not lost, that's what he requested. And that's what happened. One famous rabbi who lived during the 1500s in Cairo, Rabbi David ibn Zimra. Anyone heard of him? Known as Radvaz. I've told you, I've quoted many of his stories to you. In fact, famous story in the writings of Radvaz is where somebody asks him. Most of Radvaz's writings are responsa, shailos uchuvas. You know what that means? Questions that he was asked. And it's books published. Shailos uchuvas, many questions and answers, responsa of the Radvaz's answers. As we know today, the letters of the Rebbe that are still being published, so many volumes, I can't even tell you offhand, I don't know how many, but I believe dozens of volumes of the Rebbe's letters have already been published. So besides for the Rebbe's teachings, besides for the books that he wrote, and besides for his public talks that were published and edited by him, there's the Rebbe's letters that he hand wrote to people that are being printed, and only those that are available can be printed. My father had personal correspondence with the Rebbe. He never allowed anybody to print it, and it's not publicly available. Those that are public are public. So a limited number of the Rebbe's letters to people are available and are being published. The Radvaz, who lived in the 1500s, he was very famous for his responsa. One of the famous letters he received that I often like to quote was a person who was incarcerated for unknown reasons, and he was told he gets to have 1 day of, what do they call it, for furlough? 1 day off? And he was asking the rabbi, wrote a letter to the Radvaz, which day should he accept for this furlough? What was the rabbi's response? Right? He said, should he wait for his daughter's wedding? Should he wait for Yom Kippur? What day should he accept? And the rabbi said, today. And what's not published is he says, get on a plane and get out of the country. Just kidding, obviously 1500s. But he said, seize the opportunity now. But he was asked many questions about the laws of kosher and the exact language of Rambam. It was very important to determine, various pieces of information. And what he writes is that he examined all the good manuscripts of Mishnah Torah in Cairo, because that's where he was a rabbi and that's where Rambam was a rabbi. And he adds that they are deemed good because they are compared to the version that itself was compared against Rambam's original. Which one is it? This one here, this elaborate one. Okay, because the Rambam himself signed this version. Okay, so it's quite, this is called the Huntington manuscript. And the manuscript came, it's also, I think, in that library today in Oxford. In the 1670s, Robert Huntington lived in Aleppo, or is that Syria, and he visited the Holy Land and Egypt, and during his travels he collected Hebrew manuscripts and he donated them to Oxford University, or at some point. Very, very interesting. So today the entire copy is actually available online. If you want to see it, I could pick it up. You could find it on the internet, the entire copy. All right, so if you want, I'll do that next. I'll show you the website because we have to conclude in the next moment or so. Any other thoughts that anyone wants to... Yeah, there's a lot more to talk about here. Once printing was developed, obviously, one of the first Jewish books printed was Mishnah Torah, Rambam's Code. It was printed multiple times, And one print from 1490 was made by the famous Gershom Sonsino, is that what they were called? A very famous Jewish printer in Italy who published many Jewish classics. And in fact, the old Gemara sets, Sonsino Chumash, Sonsino Gemara, right? Very famous printing press, the Sonsino press. Okay, if you have an extra couple of 100 million rand maybe, then you could purchase a surviving copy of this print. I think it's available for about $200,000. It was at the Sotheby's auction. They had it on their website once. So for $200,000, it's actually, I don't know if you get the full set or even just a page of it. What's that? There it is. There it is. Why? I was once at Sotheby's watching a auction of a painting. I couldn't believe what it went for about, I don't remember now, a few $100 million. I could Google it. I don't remember the exact. I just remember being astounded how many millions of dollars people pay for a painting, and I was there at the auction. It was a painting then, ostensibly the only portrait that George Washington ever posed for. So it wasn't even a Van Gogh. But I'll conclude with this good old joke that I've told many, many times here. Once some people broke into the Louvre. This is after the Mona Lisa was returned. And they managed to steal some paintings. And this was unbelievable, because after the famous incident a century ago where Mona Lisa was stolen, the security was tightened and these guys got away with it. Yet they were arrested a couple of blocks later. And as they're being schlepped off from their van to the police vehicles, one of the news reporter asks them, how, after pulling off such a heist, did you guys get caught? What happened? And one of them said, well, it's very simple. You see, we just did not have the money to buy the gas for the Van Gogh. Ladies and gentlemen, come back tomorrow for Lag BaOmer. Maybe we'll do more about Rambam next week, because I have a lot more to teach you. Don't forget, if you come in person, you will get to be part of our new campaign, Pearls, where you'll be able to write about a lot of your history. And once we conclude this project, you will get to take your books home. Until then, it remains the sole property of Chabad House, so please leave them here for us, and we'll continue.